Right, here we go then. How to tune the Lectron carburetor, or the Lectron clone carburetor. As we determined in the last video, they are similar enough. It's the same adjustment method on the genuine one to what it is the clone carburetor as well. The basics of how to tune them. If you haven't done this before, take your time with it and work out where everything goes whilst you're taking it apart, because it is slightly different to a normal carb, but they are, I think overall they are very, very simple when you get to know them, especially compared to a conventional carburetor, if you like. Yeah, much easier to work with. The fact that you don't have to take them off your bike to change the jetting on them saves so much time, and then obviously a lot easier to adjust as well. But to get just to the point where it's running, rather than just running good, you can get to the point where it's running with these a lot quicker, because you haven't got to take the float bowl off to change the jets. This is how quickly it will take you to change your jetting. This is the process. Make sure your fuel tap is off. Ow, pull the lead off, don't hurt your hand. Tank off. Now, as you'll see, the best thing about these is you can change the jetting. I'm just actually pretending to undo that clip there because there's not one there. You can change the jetting whilst the carb is still attached to the bike, so you don't have to take the float bowl off, which is fantastic, especially as from the previous video, you'll know these float bowl gaskets are not ideal. You haven't got to take the carburetor out with the rubbers. You can just undo the screws and move it over. I'm going to make it even quicker by using the drill here. Take them off, pull out the slide, and then boom. You adjust your jetting, or yeah, you adjust your mixture from... First things first, you get a throttle cable with the clone carburetors. You will have to use that. These need a slightly longer throttle cable. You can see where the throttle cable goes in. Get my pointy stick. You can see where the throttle cable goes in at the top here. There's quite a long distance. This is where it hooks in at the bottom. Good sort of 75 mil probably. Downwards of free cable space you have to have. You could try your original one, but you'll, like I say, you need at least that much free cable. Yeah, that's your free cable sticking out at the end here. You need at least, you know, that much in your stock throttle cable if you want to put it on there, which means that the other end for this particular one I have in my hand is right at the end. So yeah, typically you need to use the cable provided with the kits, basically. Secondly, get yourself a pair of these measuring calipers or verniers, whatever you want to call them. They do millimeters, and they're very accurate, and they also do inches if you are that way inclined. Also, in my opinion, I said before, watch in the previous video about these where I compare a genuine one to a clone one or a fake one. This is assuming that you have done them two, well, one big thing I said about really, which is the choke plungers in the fake carburetors, in my opinion. Now, other people have said their own things, that's absolutely fine, but in my opinion, again, this is the genuine one, not the fake, so I'm using this as an example. But on the fake carburetors, this float bowl gasket on my one, or my ones actually, I've had multiple float bowl gaskets now because they all do it, they do not like fuel, and they will swell up. They are fine when they're fitted. If you get spare ones, again, watch the other video. This is assuming you've watched the other video as well. I'm not going to repeat myself. This is assuming you know about the float bowl gaskets and you know about the chokes as well, and you have done the choke. Don't blame me if you're having problems with it and you haven't replaced the choke. That's the last thing I'm going to say on that. So, jetting or tuning these carbs, how do you do it? It's very simple. There's really two things that you have to adjust on this. Well, four things you have to adjust on this carburetor, and they're all very, very, very simple. Number one, float level. First thing I adjusted, and I suggest you adjust because it's a thing you've only got to do once, really. Take that off. Now, float level. Now we can see the float level between here and here on the clone carburetor, they are not quite as visible, but you can see them. I ended up then scratching them in so I could see them. Maybe even put a bit of pen on them if you are artistic. There is your float level. I'll talk about float level on this part of the video. To help me line it up, because you have to have the carbs level on the vertical plane, I guess. You can work out if your carbs are level by leaning the bike up so it is level. I actually used a spirit level across the frame here so I could tell when the bike was level. But another way is you can sort of wedge the bike up against something with the handlebars or with the frame or the foot peg. When the bike balances by itself, it is then level. So then once the bike is level, you can then look at the back here, coming in from here, this line of fuel here should then be completely level. That's how you then know the carb is level to the engine. In terms of this level, going from here, it should sit round about there. Something like that. It will be different for each application, but there's markers on there. I purposely set mine low because of the idle issue I was having, and I didn't want it to be too full where it was sucking in fuel straight away. I put the front wheel on a ramp. When your front wheel is then lifted up enough, when this line is level, you know carburetor is then level. Whoa, there we go. So you've adjusted your float level. That's the first thing to do, and it's done. You haven't got to worry then. That means that the float bowl can then go back on and stay on. Adjust your float level with this part here. I better tell you how to do it, I guess. Right, how to adjust the float level of the carburetor. These are the floats. This is the bowl. This is the float needle inside here. That little part there should, by gravity, be on the bottom of the brass tab which these float bowls are connected to. But you can see there, it's stuck inside. Now, this is a really common problem with Lectrons. What you do, when it's fitted to the bike, you get a screwdriver, tap it. It's fell out there. That is enough for the fuel to then drop back down into the float bowl. If you can see with these clear float bowls, you can see fuel in them, which is nice. So if these haven't got fuel in there and you've turned the fuel on the bike, you have a problem. This adjuster here, this brass tab, this is how you adjust the float height, by pushing this brass tab here, bending it gently up or down. The bottom of the float needle sits on that tab, so that is your adjusting part to decide how much fuel you want this to fill up with. This is just a tap. When the fuel level raises, it goes up here and turns the fuel off. Fuel on, fuel off. If you want more fuel in the float bowl, you bend this tab down. If you want less fuel in the float bowl, you bend this tab up in the position that the carburetor is fitted in. There we go. That's the fuel height. Set your fuel height in between this level. On my carburetor, on the fake carburetor, on my motorcycle, I set it at the lower level when the motor was completely level. The fuel sat completely level in this bowl here, the whole way around, both sides. That's your fuel height. Once you've done your fuel height, the bowl can go back on and you haven't got to adjust it anymore. I suggest adjusting the tab small increments at a time. Second adjustment, the idle screw, which is here. That's the idle screw. When the slide is fitted to the bike and you've set the cable slack up correctly, make sure you've got a bit of slack here and it's not pulling up the slide on the carburetor whilst it's fitted to the bike. You can then use the idle screw to adjust the idle speed of your bike. Now, once this is fitted in, you can see that as I screw in this idle adjuster here, it moves the slide down. If it gets stuck like that, so you can screw the idle screw in here. Imagine, obviously there's no cable fitted, but you can screw the idle screw in so much where it locks it against the slide, against the side of the slide. If that happens, you need to unscrew it a little bit to get it away from the slide, move the slide up, screw the screw in, and then drop it down, and you'll tend to find the ramp of the slide easier doing it that way. If it gets stuck, just back it off and then move it up. When the carb is fitted to the bike, You then want to see a gap here. Now, if you have to screw this the whole way in and it locks out against the slide, your bike is too rich on the lower end, so you need to adjust your needle or check for other problems, which I think I have with my bike. So the bigger the gap, the higher the idle. The smaller the gap, the lower the idle. When you fit it to your bike, about halfway open. That's the maximum. That's the minimum. Set it about halfway, something like that. That will be enough to get it running, and once it's running, you can then adjust it from there. Third adjustment. Once you have set the idle, you can then adjust the metering rod height. Richer clockwise, leaner anti-clockwise. Low end adjustment. You have two adjustments on this carburetor. The low end adjustment, 0% throttle here, 50% throttle here, just where it lines up with this brass tube, where this is then the top end adjustment, which is the power jet on here. Now we're talking about these parts. If I call these needles, this is what I mean, needles, but these are actually called metering rods. The metering rods screw into the bottom of the slide here. For the sake of this demonstration, we'll screw the threads in all the way until they just disappear beyond the plastic insert there. So we call that the base level. You must adjust the needle whilst the spring is uncompressed, and you can do so with the tool easily. Once the needle is in position, you can then use your finger and gently push the metering rod in and rotate it either clockwise or anti-clockwise in 90-degree positions to move the flat side of the needle, which must face the engine intake at all times. You cannot run these backwards. What I like to do is set the free play in the metering rod. The free play is this part of it where it rotates in the collar here. In the neutral position, you have equal movement both left and right on here. Now, the basics. Here's the basics of the metering rods, how to adjust them for a richer or leaner atmosphere. This is at 0 to 50% throttle. Anything over 50%, the power jet then kicks in. The metering rods have a fatter side and they have a thinner side. This is the basics of your lean and rich adjustment on here. This is the bottom end, and this is the upper end of the 50%. So this is 0 and 50% throttle here. You can see the fatter needle is the same size in the middle as the thinnest needle is towards the 3/4 point. So that's the sort of difference in size you're talking about, the fat needle and the thin needle. There we go. There's the differences. I suggest the metering rod that comes with the carburetor fitted, or use the middle one on here from 0 to 50% throttle. You richen the mixture by turning the slide clockwise, and I suggest using 1/4 of a turn increments at a time, and then decompress the spring or compress the spring, twist the metering rod and return it to the relaxed position facing the fatter part of the slide here. The best way to picture this on these carburetors, there is a hole here which the metering rod runs down and goes into. That goes into the float bowl here and picks up the fuel. When you adjust this rod, you are essentially raising or lowering the height of the metering rod in this hole here, allowing more fuel or decreasing the amount of fuel which is pulled through when the engine is running. It's leaner up here, leaner meaning less fuel, because the flat side of the carburetor, which lets the fuel past, is fatter up here and filling more of the hole up in the carburetor. That is your adjustment of fuel at the 0 to 50% throttle. The thinner the rod, the more fuel it will let through, and the fatter the rod, the less fuel it will let through. There's two ways to measure how far the rod is screwed in or out of the slide. from the brass collar here, you can grab your measuring calipers and go from the end of the rod to the brass insert here. So just for example, that would be 53. Once you then screw it in, we'll do a turn just for that sake. You can then re-measure and see that it's dropped down to 52. The second way, which I personally prefer, but you have to be a bit more cautious with this, is to go from the top of the slide to the bottom of the metering rod there. Now you have to be careful not to compress the spring when you are measuring. The brass tube here is your power jet. Anything over 50% throttle, which is there, the power jet then comes into play because the slide has lifted up enough to expose the opening for the power jet here. The vacuum from the engine can then draw fuel into the power jet, which comes from the float bowl itself. And the fuel will rise up here into the power jet and spray straight into the path of the carburetor for it to be drawn into. So anything from 50% throttle to 100% throttle is done, the adjustments of richer or leaner are made from the power jet here, which we've said if you screw it clockwise whilst the carburetor is facing you this way, the airbox is this side. If you screw this jet in clockwise, it will lean the mixture off and give you less fuel. It works just like a tap. There's a needle in here which pushes down or up. So if you screw it clockwise, it will make it leaner, and if you screw it anti-clockwise, it will make it richer. A baseline setting from these, so when it's screwed from all the way in, you haven't got to do it up too tight, just where it stops spinning on here, is anywhere from 3/4 of a turn out to 1 1/4 turns out. The power jet must only be adjusted once you have done the low to mid speed adjustment with your metering rod. So when the bike is up to speed, you then need to find an area where you can get on full throttle for about 5 seconds or so. If the bike runs lean at the top end, you then need to make it richer. If it runs rich at the top end, you then need to make it leaner. Tune them on the road. There's no point tuning these carburetors on the bench. If your bike is static, don't waste your time tuning it there. If you get to that point, you can then take a spark plug reading to see what the fuel is burning like, to see what the plug is like. If you change metering rod on here, you'll have to readjust your idle, because these metering rods do the low to mid end. If you've fitted this to your bike and got it running, and it's not running correctly, you can get a rough idea of whether you are rich or lean through how far this gap is here from the slide to the bottom of the carb. If it's idling and you've got it running, but the gap when the engine is stopped and you can take the airbox boot off or the air filter off, and you can see this gap in here and the gap is really small, it likely means that you are too lean on the lower end and you need to either adjust the rod or change the rod. If you have got the bike running and it's not running correctly and you take the airbox boot off and the gap is large here, it likely means that you are too rich on the metering rod and you need to lean it off. Or if you've done all these tips and still can't get it running, you then probably have an issue with your bike. On a 2-stroke, such as faulty reeds or a vacuum leak, for example, which I believe is what I have on my bike. Faulty intake reeds, which are allowing fuel to be pushed back through on low speed running, which is then making a rich condition at the very low end. So on my bike, this slide is not up enough to make it idle. It needs more air because there's too much fuel going into there, because it's being blown back from the reeds into the carburetor here, and then giving it more fuel than what it needs. Do not ride with the power jet screwed all the way in, because you will get no flow of fuel over 50% throttle and it will be running really, really lean. So yeah, make sure this is never screwed in all the way. It wants to be from 3/4 to 1 1/4 turns out from a baseline setting. The engine must also be pulling enough of a vacuum to get the fuel to be drawn through here. So just cracking the throttle on will not give enough vacuum for it to draw fuel here. So that's where you need to do at least a 5-second test of flat out. So then you've got enough airflow to draw the fuel up here and into it. So there's no good just cracking it and seeing if it has made it any better or not. You need to ride it at full throttle for at least 5 seconds and then adjust your power jet. Adjust the power jet at 1/8 turn increments. So about that much, 1/8 of a turn. Each time you adjust it, do it 1/8 of a turn. Anything more than 1/4 of a turn on the metering rod and 1/8 of a turn on the power jet, you give yourself the opportunity to miss the sweet spot between making it too rich and too lean. So 1/4 of a turn on the metering rod and 1/8 of a turn on the power jet here. A few questions which are going to be asked, I'm sure. Why is my bike bogging? If you whack the throttle open from idle to mid-range to 50% throttle and the motor stutters like it wants to shut off, your rod is likely too lean and you need to richen it up. If it gurgles, it's too rich, you adjust the metering rod in 1/4 of a turn increments. Why is the top end of the throttle flat? If you're running wide open throttle and your bike feels flat, you can then richen the power jet in 1/8 turn increments until it runs how you want it to. If it stutters or gurgles, it's too lean and you can turn the power jet in 1/8 of a turn increments until you get where you want to. Why is the bike hard to start? You have to use the choke if your bike is cold. If it's hard to start when it's hot, the metering rod is probably too lean, so adjust that 1/4 of a turn richer and try it again. Once the bike is running, you can then pull the choke up and the RPMs should drop significantly. And on the vent lines that come from these, so there's 2 clear hoses, one runs from here, one runs from here. You can run them straight down behind the swinging arm. You'll likely have a few other hoses down there as well. So yeah, run them straight down into the swinging arm. If you do go through a lot of deep water and the hoses are likely to go into the water, you can then run one of these into the airbox housing. So there we go. There's a quick guide on how to tune the Lectron carburetors, whether it is a genuine or a fake like I have fitted here. They work the same way. Go back and watch it again. I'll try and keep it basic. There's a lot more you can go into on these, but you don't really need to if you just want to get the bike running well. Like I say, I like these. I've got a couple of genuine ones. I've got a few fake ones. They all work well for the money. Other than that, yeah, I hope I helped some people. There's a basic guide for adjusting the carburetors or tuning the carburetors. And join me next time. Make sure you watch the other videos we have as well. Bye-bye.